Periodization, I think, is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and runners are most familiar with mesocycles. Those are usually a 4-week block. 3 weeks of that would be a build, and then you'd have 1 week of cutback, and then you would start that again. What we want to talk about today is macro cycles, and this is really looking at 6 months or a year. What most of us are doing is some form of bouncing from one 16-week cycle to the next, many of us without a lot of thought to the bigger picture, and that's where the macro cycle would come in.
Something that doesn't help is the whole no days off, there is no off season mentality and mantra. I think it probably did a number on people's psyche.
This is the time to start the rehab phase, see your PT, get a massage. If you don't take the downtime now, it's not going to get better in the next training cycle. Mm-hmm. These things rarely respond well to more training.
When you don't have the vocabulary or the framework to think about these other things, it's easy to skip them. We're afraid of downtime.
Or non-structured
time. And we hope the conversation that we have today and equipping people with a bit more knowledge, but also confidence in being able to employ these other phases, that it makes being afraid of downtime less scary. And it does then give you a chance to think, what is it that I want to do this year? I don't think we've ever really introduced ourselves on this podcast.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, a lot of podcasts start with, I'm Matt. And then you would go,
I'm Molly.
But we are super excited because we are back from a short time away while we recovered during the December and early January
November.
And November. Well, no, we had a number of episodes in November, from bonus episodes and New York. But suffice to say, we've taken a little bit of time to, as everyone should, and anything that they're working on, be it training or running a business or doing a podcast, to take some time away and recoup.
And also plan our upcoming season.
Which is a great segue into what we would like to talk about today. I don't know about you, but I think winter for most people, despite it often being a period of slowing down for work or whatever, certainly leading into the holiday season can be not only stressful, but tiring.
Yeah. And it gets dark earlier.
And then we get sad. Seasonal affective disorder. Yes.
It might make you ineffective. But I don't think that's the condition.
Seasonal effectiveness.
So, Matt, it's been a few months since your last race. How have you been handling the off season?
Initially, pretty okay, because we've got the business and we've got all of the things that we have going on. And so it was easy for me to say, great, I finished my race and I can now move into doing other things, and actually enjoyed some of the time off. But I think, like many athletes, I really started to have that itch to want to get back more quickly into...
I was going to say, as your coach, I think it was maybe 2 weeks after that you started saying it felt like a really long time since you did a workout.
Yes, that is true. You are my coach, and that is a correct assessment about what happened. But I also think that as co-coaches, we recognize, and I have recognized, that a transition period and an off-season is essential. You know, the marathon that I did went very well, that I've been chasing for 6 years. I finished, I think, 2025 pretty well. And I wanted to ensure that I thoughtfully considered what the next couple of months were going to be, knowing that the next major thing on my calendar was Boston. And the last thing that I would advise anybody that we are co-coaching, that should include how I would advise myself, is to then make sure that I'm not overtraining for months on end and being exhausted by continuing to train through November and December, when I really don't need to go at it, really hard until, about this time.
Yeah.
So for
And
the
I
last
think-
couple of months, I've been really managing this transition phase, which has been difficult, but I think something that has been a little bit easier for me to do this year in particular, given how much we have talked about it for our athletes, and has given me some comfort in how to manage it for myself.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that, especially after something like a marathon, your body does kind of need that deep recovery period.
Yeah.
For bones and for, kind of all of the niggles and things that can come with a hard training cycle. Like thinking back, I think I've had either 3 or 4 metatarsal stress fractures. I don't recall, but all of them came actually after the goal race. And I think probably were the results of coming back too quickly.
Yeah. Well, and I had a really full year. Well, full year for me. So I did 3 major things, right? We did Empire State Trail, Vermont 100, and Bay State. And all 3 of those things were those were my A efforts. And I really didn't do that much outside of that. And I think over the last couple of years, I have gotten a lot more confident as a runner to really focus on these things and also engage in the wonderful social aspects of running and training without feeling the need to race all the time. So, when I think of athletes that come to us and why we wanted to do this episode, there's, in general terms, 3 types of athletes that are going through the year with their plan. And one might be, I think probably that I might be closest to, which is that you have 1 or 2 big races. You're not really maybe you're doing training around that, but you're not rolling from one, to the next. The second, I think, is what we see a lot of, particularly in this current running boom, is that you've got race, repeat, race, injury, period of time off, wondering how they got injured, and then kind of getting back into it. And so sometimes those races, quote unquote, are sometimes A races or they're B races, or it's like you've got 1 A race, but you've got 12 B races, or you say to yourself, you're going to enter it with I'm going to largely jog this. And you don't because, we're competitive and we get excited. And then the third is maybe New York specific and perhaps a flavor of that, which is that, New York, for better and worse, has this 9+1 program for the New York City Marathon, which means that you've got a ton of people signing up for races all of the time. But many people sort of acknowledge that they're not really racing, many of them, but they are things that people put on the calendar. And the potential detriment to that, which we'll talk about, is that it can impact or impede what you otherwise might have done in a very thoughtful and considered training plan. You might not have put in this 4-mile thing that you're then going to have to go travel to. And then all of the things that go around that and sort of added stress and waking up early and not getting, all of those things can compound, even if it's a race that you're just kind of doing for, I don't want to say for fun, but you're just doing it to do it easy.
Check the box.
And to check the box for these types of, programs, or because this is what all my friends are doing. And, there's the social aspect. And so what we're hoping to cover today is to proactively think about how we would craft a season, right? From transition of the off season into competition and then back around again, and to lay out a framework for all of our listeners here about what each of those phases look like, the importance of each of those phases, the benefits, and how that can improve our ability to not only train and race, but then recover in a way that gives us confidence that we're not losing fitness, as well as giving us the ability to reset without sacrificing what a lot of people really enjoy, which are the social aspects of training and racing. So to put a fine point on it, really reconsidering and rebalancing what we'll talk about as pre-competition and competition phase with these other phases. And when you don't have the vocabulary or the framework to think about these other things, it's easy to skip them. So our main hope with this episode is to give you confidence in these other phases, that they not only serve a purpose and that they will improve your performance, but that they are things that can be a net positive, as opposed to just always going to be training. And that isn't that necessarily better, isn't more better, right? There's the sort of parable of the two lumberjacks. Do you know this one? There's the two.
So.
Oh, okay. you sound skeptical. There's the two lumberjacks, and they both start at 9 in the morning and end at 5 o'clock at night. And one lumberjack is just like he keeps going, and he's so he gets to the end of the day and he counts up how much wood he has, and he has whatever he has. The other lumberjack, is going at it as well, but then he leaves for a half hour and comes back. And every single day, the guy who leaves for a half hour and comes back chops up more wood than the person who has chopped the entire day. And at one point, the guy who's chopping the entire day is like, "What are you doing for this half hour?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm just going to sharpen my axe." And so it's a little corny and cheesy, but it demonstrates that there is very much a value and benefit to taking a break. There are things that you can do that will perhaps literally, but also metaphorically sharpen your ability to race better.
Yeah. I actually thought when you said the two, I thought you were going to say the two bowls, and that was going to take a different turn.
Oh, what's that one? Is this podcast safe?
It is not.
Oh, okay. All right. I don't want to make this an explicit podcast. We try and make this relatively clean. So, Molly, with all of that said, can you first, at a super high level, talk about periodization? People hear about that, and I think that they kind of understand that there are these phases. But as we just talked about, there's this focus on only a couple of those phases. So let's talk about that first. We'll then talk about some of the benefits, and then we'll go into each one individually.
Yeah, periodization, I think, is a word that gets thrown around a lot. And most runners probably are most familiar with mesocycles, which are the 3 to 4 week, usually, blocks of a training plan where you're clearly focusing on threshold work or you're doing a little speed block. And we understand that those are focused parts of a training cycle that are meant to develop a specific adaptation. Those are usually, if it's a 4-week block, traditionally 3 weeks of that would be a build, and then you'd have 1 week of cutback, and then you would start that again. So that's kind of a very simple periodization that's considered sort of the middle of the 3 sizes. So you have macro, meso, and micro. So what we want to talk about today is macro cycles. And those are much bigger than your 16-week training plan that you might download for a race or that your run club is doing. And this is really looking at 6 months or a year. And so it's something you might hear about from pro athletes that are often talking about planning a season at a fall race and a spring race, and those are going to be their focuses. What most of the rest of us are doing is some form of just kind of bouncing from one 16-week cycle to the next, many of us without a lot of thought to the bigger picture. And that's where the macro cycle would come in. So there's 4 phases to the macro cycle as it's traditionally laid out. There's a preparatory phase, which is the longest. And so if we're talking about a 6-month cycle, that would actually be about the first half of it. So 10 to 12 weeks is your preparatory phase. Then you would move into the pre-competition and competition phases, which is more the meat of what you would think of as a traditional training cycle. And then you have a transition and recovery period after the competition.
And perhaps that's why, because it's the meat of these plans, has been the focus. It's often not on the page for these other things that are super important, that when people stack these plans, and yes, this episode will probably be a little bit more geared towards marathons, but I think this is certainly true still of halves too.
I think for
certainly ultras. I think as you get to 5K, right? Like
Yeah, you're turning around
you can turn
races
around
much quicker.
Yeah, but there you don't need as much of the same like base and aerobic engine.
Although if you're running cross country, you're still going to have your summer prep phase.
Yeah.
So to recap, we have the transition sort of off season, goes into a preparatory phase, pre-competition, competition, and then back to transition. So Matt, at the top of the show, you talked about your transition phase that you were, I think, starting to transition out of. Have you seen
Lots of
some
transitions.
benefits from taking that break?
I've definitely seen a very big mental reset. And I think that has been in two ways. One that was probably expected and one that was unexpected. So the expected one might be you've taken time off, and so you're not like constantly run down with the like, I've got to get out again. I think the one that was unexpected was now that I'm kind of transitioning out of that and back into training is that now I'm like, I have to get back into the habit. And I don't mean the latter one as a sort of like something to fear. It's just a thing that because I have focused a lot in the last couple of months on really taking time, spending time with family and I think being a little bit more forgiving for myself during December, particularly with, the shop and seeing family, of like always getting out. And also for days in December where I just really didn't feel like it, that was where I probably gave myself the most amount of grace to say, it's okay.
Yeah.
And as we'll talk about when we get to each of these phases, you can cut back on volume and you can cut back on what might be your max intensity. I was still doing some workouts, right?
Yeah.
And that was still actually keeping it fun. But so the benefits certainly to start out with, I think, come with some degree of mental forgiveness for myself when I don't want to get out there. But it also meant that I was able to break from sometimes just being a bit tired and trying to get out. I am now just dealing with the mental getting back in.
Yeah.
The other thing that it has allowed me to do is that I have had a bit more time to get to the gym. And so from what am I doing in the off season, it's that I've been able to focus on some things that I haven't, that I often am not able to, or I often don't feel like I'm able to focus on as much because, we think of specificity of our training and the amount of running that is happening, especially for myself as a higher mileage athlete. I spend a lot of time running, and that means that I am not spending as much time in the gym, which might be okay later in my cycle. And for many people, whether you're a high mileage or not type of person, you're probably spending more time running. And while we would still think that strength training is critical and it should be done at probably at least once a week, shout out to our episode on strength training where we talk about this a bit, and we'll also talk a bit about it today. But during the off season, I was able to get in some different stimulus. So that's another benefit.
Yeah. And I think, I think that you also were able to focus a little bit more of that strength training on areas that tend to be not necessarily weaknesses, but areas where things might start to get sore later in training. And you can kind of do a little of that, like shoring up before the training really gets heavy.
Yeah. And then kind of just away from the benefits of an off season, but transitioning, no pun intended, into the benefits in general of thinking about the full set of phases, not just the competition, pre-competition, is that I think we're afraid of downtime
or non-structured
time. And we hope the conversation that we have today and equipping people with a bit more, not only knowledge, but also confidence in being able to employ these other phases, that it makes the being afraid of downtime less scary. And that it does then give you a chance to, outside of a pre-competition competition mode, think, what is it that I want to do this year? I think we've had a number of those conversations with our athletes. We've certainly had it in the context of me of what do I want to do? And so when you're not signed up for something immediately and you commit to having that conversation, it actually gives you an opportunity to think more clearly about what your true goals are, rather than, well, my goals are taken up because of this 9+1 program. If your calendar is already set because this is, and look, I understand, like, this is how people get into New York. I understand that.
And we are going to talk about kind of how to navigate that.
Right.
If that's the position you're in.
But you still want to, I think, be more conscious and thoughtful about what your plan is for the year that allows you to then fill in where these phases go and how to approach them. And finally, I would say, as I highlighted earlier, it allows us to realign our understanding of racing versus training. When we're always in pre-competition and competition phase, which is, as we said, most of what you get downloaded from these plans, we're mostly in a training to race. And I think some of the most thoughtful conversations we've had with some of our athletes most recently are the ones that currently are not signed up for something. And we have a couple right now where we're talking about their general fitness. And we know that they'll eventually sign up for something. We know that it'll probably be like a half or a full, or in some cases, ultras. But it does give this ability to focus on training as training and for general fitness. And we can also have a bit more fun with than a training cycle than jumping straight into, well, we're 10 weeks out or 12 weeks out or 14 weeks out. And there's like a plan that comes with that when you get to those phases.
Right. And I think the other thing that having that time allows is being able to look back thoughtfully and figure out maybe what your limiting factors have been previously, and having some time where you can actually just focus on that rather than the next half marathon or whatever's on the calendar.
So jumping then into the first phase you talked about, the transition phase, this is where most people are probably right now, including myself. I'm at the tail end of it, and that's because Boston is an early spring race. Some people might already be or starting to think about, March or early April half marathons. There's certainly a couple of like local marathons that I would say are in March, but there's probably not too many that are not like trail ultras or trail marathons that are happening out, before March just because of the weather. It's probably worth mentioning too that I think something that doesn't help is the whole no days off. There is no off season mentality and mantra. I think it probably did a number on people's psyche. And I remember when, I don't say this pejoratively against this other brand, but I remember when Tracksmith came out with like the no days off, and they had to like remind people, we don't literally mean no days off, and people, got into run streaks and, that type of thing. But this period of an off season is usually right around 4 weeks, 5 weeks, maybe 6 weeks, depending on whether what it is that the next thing is, after a marathon. And it's often skipped, right? So Molly, how should an athlete practically approach this phase?
Well, first, I think it needs to be planned, ideally, and not just kind of an afterthought, which is what most people tend to do after their race. It's like, okay, what am I going to do now? I'm either going to sign up for another race because I'm excited because my race went well, or it didn't go well. But in any case, I want to race as soon as possible again. Or they just kind of fall off the wagon until the next thing rolls around. And I would advocate, if it's a 4-week or a 6-week block, really thinking about that in a couple week pieces. So the first is, let's say you ran a marathon as your last event. For the first 2 weeks, the priority really needs to be recovery and letting your body do the deeper repairs that it needs to do, both following not just the race effort, but the whole training cycle that came before. So this is the period where, I mean, if you take 2 weeks off, you're really not going to lose any fitness, even if it was completely off.
And I would hazard to say that most people probably actually do take at least a week off.
Yeah.
But what's the sort of like the absolute bare minimum? Because I know we talked about this in the famous episode that you and I recorded that we didn't actually record. So listeners should know that we recorded this whole episode in November.
Right after New York.
Right after New York Marathon. And we were going to talk about all of this off-season phase and to like help you prepare.
And a lot of marathon specific recovery.
Yeah. And the mics were on and everything was set up, but the way that the setup works is that one thing has to get muted and the other thing stays unmuted, and we just muted the wrong thing. And unfortunately, after the first 2 minutes of our hour and a half, 2 hour probably recording session, nothing was actually recorded. So, but you had talked then about a study that sort of said this is like the absolute bare minimum.
The TLDR, as I recall, was the first 48 hours you really have no business running.
Yeah.
And things are kind of...
But people take it as like a pride thing to like go out 2 days later. And I look at that and be like,
yeah, there's really, there was not any upside.
It's just not a smart thing to do. By any
I mean, there's
measure.
just your body, even if you've had a really great race and you were very well trained for it, you're going to be dealing with a lot of inflammation, and you're really only going to be adding to that and not getting any benefit from it. So 48 hours was a no-no.
And that was 48 hours for a marathon, right?
This was all for a marathon.
So I suspect for like a 5K, it's probably not. You might not need like 48 hours, but
I mean... you run
a lot of people.
You run a qualifier and then a final.
Yeah.
So we're talking about marathons here, but then
and probably halves.
Yeah, 4 days later, for most people, if you were well trained for the event, seemed like you were probably in safe territory. And I think that's usually what we tell our athletes is like absolute minimum is 4 days, and then maybe you can start doing some active recovery type stuff if you feel like it. By about 6 days out, most of the biomarkers return to normal. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to feel like it.
Right.
And I would always say if it doesn't sound fun, then you shouldn't do it.
Yeah.
And again, you can take, 10 to 14 days off and not lose measurable fitness.
Yeah. I would also say that this is where when you do these massive efforts, I find, like most things that don't have a good data size of these massive things, the extremes tend to be where our data implements fall apart.
Yeah.
And I don't know how useful, effing Garmin will tell you, like, you're ready, like 2 days later, like you're ready to get back at it. Here's a 10 by 800 at,
Yeah. After my 24-hour.
Oh, I do remember this.
And I was sleeping. It was like daytime because
just to make sure people, like, we're talking about Molly running for 24 hours straight, essentially as fast as she could.
I ran the thing. I came home. It was mid-morning by that point. I immediately went to sleep, and because my watch was had not defaulted to like do not disturb, it woke me up like 15 minutes after I laid down and told me I needed to move again.
Yeah, our point here is like we over-index on data that we are told that is aligned with what we would like.
Yeah.
And I think you want something to tell you that you're okay. And when your watch tells you, I think clearly if somebody's getting something like that, where it's like the next day and you just like scream at your watch, like, F you. But I think that's also true of things that are more subtle, but still tell you you're fine, whether that's your HRV or like some Whoop or an Oura ring or whatever it is. I think it's fair to say that like, it's just good, not only common sense, but backed by data that the first week, even if you took every single day off, which is what pros do, you're not going to lose fitness.
Yeah.
So in So let's talk about how much less running we're talking about in the 3 to 4 week period after that 1 week.
Yeah. So after those first 2 weeks, still the focus really should be on recovery. If you have any injuries, this is the time to start the rehab phase, see your PT, get a massage, do all of those things. And I think that applies not just to obviously something that, maybe has been a more major injury, but the little niggles that happen during a training cycle. Because if you don't take the downtime now, it's not going to get better in the next training cycle. These things very rarely respond well to more training. Occasionally you can beat them into submission.
That's a story for another day. And that's also a like, not
advised.
Not advised. Ill advised. I think that it's also fair to say that we often hear, and is true, that full rest is also not usually the case either. And here is where I think the nuance is.
Yeah. And this is, I think, where the weeks 3 and 4 sort of start to come in. And you're running again. You can substantially reduce the volume.
Let's say you were 40 to 50 miles per week type of athlete for the majority of your training. What are you coming down to?
So it depends on how long you're going to stay at reduced volume. If it's going to be a week or two, you can cut it 50%. And as long as you maintain a little bit of intensity in that, you're not going to lose fitness. So, if you're running every other day, maybe a couple of those runs are going to have some strides. Or some hill repeats, but we're not talking about, stacks of mile repeats or anything like that.
Yeah. Hills and strides, baby.
Yeah.
That's just do those two things.
If you're going to reduce your volume for a longer time, let's say, things like you're traveling for work for an extended period, or like those kind of life interruptions, or it's the holidays and you're not planning to train very hard, for 4 weeks or 6 weeks. There we're looking at more like 20 to 30% reduction in volume. So maybe you're not going to cut back to half, but you can still maintain your fitness for a longer period by still cutting back a decent amount. So if you were running 50 miles a week, maybe now you're running 35. And it's kind of runner's choice if it's easier for you to cut that back into shorter runs. Or I think we usually, when we're coaching people, try to give people an extra rest day, just because for many people, the chance to sleep in or just to not have to cram a run into a day is often more restorative, I think, than just running a shorter run.
Right. And I think a lot of that, is going to be from dropping probably the long run, right? That's going to be a good chunk of the reduction. So it sounds like, though, what I'm hearing from you is that intensity is a really important element to this lever that's being pulled, of intensity and duration of the time off. So if I'm maintaining higher intensity, then I might be able to sustain a slightly longer reduction in volume for at least a period of time. I wouldn't keep that indefinitely, because you still need volume to sustain the active recovery elements of how you would keep intensity. And even in then, I think we're not talking about the same intensity as peak training. You're talking about a reduction in intensity to, hills and strides.
Yeah. I mean, in things like 30-30 intervals or something, but you don't have to do a boatload of them, but just still kind of getting your heart rate up, putting out some power. Those are kind of the boxes that you need to check.
Yeah.
Also, if there's a specific thing that you have really worked on in your previous training, say you just spent a whole training block really working on getting your lactate threshold up, I would keep kind of pinging that type of workout. If it's something that you've really intentionally boosted, it's easy to lose those type of adaptations if you're not touching that adaptation now and then.
So there's something I'd like you to elaborate on a bit, because I think may not be an intuitive element of an off season, which is that we're still talking about doing some intensity. And for many people, and I'll count myself years ago, of just, I thought the off season just meant you ran easy the whole time.
Yeah.
And that's not what we're saying here. We're saying that you can still have some intensity. And what does the sort of, I think there's been a couple studies on this, but what's one of the main studies shown on, I thought they had a group that did only easy versus with some intensity. Can you talk a bit about that to give people comfort on how to approach this in a way where having some intensity can still mean that you're getting the mental benefits that I talked about when we were talking about benefits, but that you're not losing the fitness, which is what most people really fear.
Yeah. So there was a study, it was not a huge sample size. It was 16 elite cyclists. I think this is the one that you were thinking of.
Mm-hmm.
That was during a 3-week transition period after their competitive season. So both groups took a 60% reduction in training. So 60%, more than half of their volume was dropped.
Which is pretty substantial.
Yeah.
I think it would be out of line with what people would want to do, because 60% sounds like a really large number to drop, or that they would assume that dropping 60% inherently means that I'm also probably going to be losing fitness.
Yeah.
And maybe you don't care about that, or maybe you do, but that certainly if you do care about that, you might worry.
Right. So one group did only low intensity riding, which we would sort of equate with only easy running. The other group did 1 session per week with 3 sets of 3 by 30 seconds max sprints, 4 minutes between the sprints, which is a nice long time, and then 15 minutes between the sets. So this is not a crazy, I mean, you're going max power, but you're going for 30 seconds and you're getting a full recovery in between. That's not a workout that I think is going to really kick your ass as far as feeling it the next day.
So maybe this is like 4x400 or something like that. Like it's some speed you're definitely pushing.
Or 200s.
Right.
Yeah.
Or 200s, but with like 3 minutes in between or, whatever.
Yeah. So the sprint group actually improved their sprint speed and they maintained other fitness metrics.
So I think that's a key.
Yeah.
I mean, that's important, because I think most of the time people assume you're just going to lose fitness during the off season.
Yeah. So they maintained everything else and they actually got better at sprint speed. And then they also, the thing that I liked about this study was that they also they used the athlete burnout questionnaire, which is meant to assess your sort of mental recovery. And both groups scored the same.
Right. Meaning that they felt more recovered despite the fact they were continuing some degree of intensity.
To some degree, actually, I think there's also the boredom factor of doing the same thing every day, and that becomes a grind. So I think, there probably is an argument just from sort of a freshness, keeping the fun in things side to do a little bit
spicy.
Yeah.
So a skeptical person might say, you've just told me that I can reduce my volume and somehow improve my speed. Why don't I just do that all the time?
I mean, if what you're concerned about is your sprint speed, then that is actually probably what you should do as a distance runner.
Right.
If you're not looking to just improve sprint speed, then we need to start looking at aerobic pace, which is the next thing we will talk about.
Okay. So that is a lovely transition into the
preparatory phase.
Preparatory.
Or
phase.
preparatory.
Preparatory? It depends on which part of the globe
I think I'm going to say
from.
prep phase, because otherwise I'm inevitably going to oscillate. So this is what most runners would also refer to as base building.
Yep.
I think the general conception
and also what I think I am transitioning into, and for many people this can be as long or as short as it needs to be.
Yeah, I would say true deep aerobic adaptations take 8 to 12 weeks. I would say there's probably 2 scenarios where you really want to consider the 8 to 12 week build.
I have an idea. I'm curious what you're going to say.
Do you want to take a guess?
I think one guess is going to be that you are returning from injury. And I would say that the second is going to be you've just taken time off. So if you've taken an extended period of time off and your off season that we just talked about was a lengthy period of time, you may or may not have been doing some sprints and hills here and there. If it was a long period of time, you probably were doing mostly easy. And so I think if you are coming from that, I would say you probably want to do a much longer preparatory base building phase.
So I was going to kind of lump those two together.
Okay.
It's just like you have come from reduced volume. I think the other one that I was going to distinguish is if you're moving up in race distance substantially. So you went from
that's fair.
maybe 5K, 10K, and your next race is going to be a marathon, for example, and the training load and probably peak mileage are going to be very different. I think I'm also going to make the case for anybody to try this. And I think particularly a couple cases that we'll get into, but I think if you're somebody that we hear this a lot as coaches, like if I do more than 45 miles a week, I get hurt, like insert your favorite mileage there. But I think if you are somebody that consistently gets injured when you've tried to go above a particular number, I'm going to talk about.
That happened to me in high school, by the way.
Oh,
it was always 45.
Interesting.
Yeah. Whenever I got to about 40 miles or above when I was in high school, I kept getting hurt.
Look at you now. So I'm going to talk later about kind of how a prep phase might address that. And then the other one is if you have kind of stagnated maybe in a particular, you're doing training and you feel like you're training harder and your results are not improving. I think there's also an argument for maybe taking a longer base build.
And what does before we get into the longer base build, what does a shorter base build look like? Would it not be like 3 to 4 weeks, since you can generally get some degree of adaptation?
You can get some degree of
within 3 to 4,
adaptation.
meaning like you almost have like half of that or the full length. So you're either doing 3 to 4 weeks or you're doing like 8 to 10 weeks.
So you start to get the improvements in cardio and some enzymatic adaptations like in between 2 and 8 weeks. So you will definitely see results from that. For the like deep mitochondrial growth and function, that's a 2 to 3 month.
I'm talking about real adaptations, not just like, biomechanical.
Yeah, no, but I mean, cardio improvement and enzymes are partly what is signaling and transporting lactate and things like that. So those are very real effects that will improve running, and they happen quicker. But if you're not sort of starting more than 12 weeks out from your goal race, you're not going to have the full aerobic benefit. And I would argue, and the case I'm going to make is that kind of the point of the prep phase is that we're building fitness that we want to bring to our training cycle, like the race training cycle that most people would think of as that like 16-week plan. That you're going to build fitness before that's more general aerobic fitness in this base build. And then you bring that bigger engine to your training, as opposed to trying to build and tune the engine in the 16 weeks.
Yeah. Whenever I hear the word aerobic fitness, I think of those like 80s videos of like those like fitness classes with the leg warmers.
I am knitting leg warmers.
You are,
currently.
yeah. You were knitting leg warmers earlier today. But that's what I think of, like neon. Yours are like a nice charcoal.
They're tweed.
Yeah, but I think that's what I always think of when I hear that phrase.
Step aerobics. We could include step aerobics in our base build.
That would be when I was an RA in college, because of course I was an RA in college. We did a talent show. And just to be clear, this was a talent show of the RAs that we put on for the youth. And because we were like, we're awesome. And my talent, I had copied this whole like aerobic dance routine. I couldn't do it now, but I figured this is something you should know about me.
That's great.
Yeah.
I will carry that information with me for the rest of the episode. So, the prep phase.
Yes.
So the main objective here is to increase overall running, and it's primarily done at low intensity. So this is also where many bro podcasters are talking about, primarily bro podcasters are talking about zone 2. This is your zone 2 gains.
This is the zone 2 work.
This is your zone 2 work.
Got it.
This is work at a low conversational aerobic level that is really training your slow twitch fiber, which is really what we're after here. We're trying to
for marathons.
For marathons and for halves. And I mean, honestly, everything down to like, I think the 800 is really the turn point to where fast twitch becomes more important.
Yeah.
But what we're trying to do in this phase and why it takes a long time, if you're really going to do it right, is we have muscle fiber on a spectrum from very fast twitch, which does not use oxygen to make energy, down to slow twitch, which thrives on oxygen to make energy. And then there's everything in between. And the more essentially long, slow distance you do, the more you can kind of push at least the middle and low end fibers to become more efficient in using oxygen, which is what we want for any aerobic dominant distance.
Right.
So this is a phase where, and this is probably the only time this is true, more is more. So the more aerobic volume you can get in, the more you're going to get out of it. This is also, since we're the furthest from our race at this point, the period where we can do less specific work and we're building, in some ways, less specific fitness. So cross-training here actually is a great option, and particularly for running, since it is an impact sport, there's really only so much running anybody can tolerate. So, put it in on a bike, row, swim, all of the kind of other modes are equally useful for this. And especially in this early phase, you're really just concerned about getting time at that intensity. And for most runners, and this is a conversation that we often have with athletes, for most people, if you're trying to get faster, the first answer is going to be adding volume and just running more miles, and not necessarily running more workouts, but just getting more miles in. So there was a 2021 study that looked at world-class long-distance runners and was trying to find what the most predictive attribute was that contributed to overall time and success. And it looked at it over the first 7 years of their career, which I think was interesting. They took, I think it was 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, I believe was the increments, but 59% of performance could be attributed simply to volume. So I think that the takeaway to that is both run more miles and run them in a way that you can keep running more miles. So not getting hurt, building both a strong engine and a strong chassis that can actually take the mileage.
Do you think this complicates the whole volume versus intensity debate? Because I feel like the answer is both, which is very unsatisfying, but that they're important in different phases.
That
the volume is important during this phase that we're talking about now, the preparatory phase. And then you've got intensity, which will be more important in the pre-competition and competition phases. But that these statements can skew somebody's understanding of what is inherently more important, even though they both serve their purpose at certain times, not only in your career, as is evidenced here, but in a given macro cycle.
Yeah. And part of the point of the prep phase is to be able to get that volume in before you're adding the intensity, because that's usually where people start to get hurt, is you're both trying to peak in volume and get 2 or 3 quality sessions in a week if you're in a 16 or 18 week training plan, trying to do that while you're also at high mileage. And maybe it's not the peak mileage of that plan, but you're still probably running a decent number of miles at the point that all of that is happening. It's hard to get both adaptations benefits at once, and it's also just putting a lot of strain on your body. So the argument here is, if you do a big volume block first, let's say previous cycles you've gone up to 50 miles a week, and that's always been kind of where you've found your ceiling. And if you try to do a plan that peaks at 60 every time, you've gotten hurt. So this is kind of where I'm coming back to, if you're kind of hitting that injury ceiling, try doing the 60 miles a week all easy or mostly easy before you start doing the race plan training. And if your body can if it can't handle 60 miles a week all easy, it is certainly not going to handle it with the fatigue of a training plan.
Mm-hmm.
And asking it to do that for the first time in a training plan is of a lot to ask.
Yeah.
So again, the prep phase is kind of that time to build.
You mean preparatory phase?
I do.
Yes.
The point is to build a body that can handle the training that you want to do.
Yeah.
And then the other component to that, of course, would be strength. So because we're not doing a ton of speed workouts or threshold or things like that that are really going to leave us sore, there is more time to get in 2 or 3 strength sessions a week. And this would be the time also to try to do the strength work that you actually build strength. So that's going to be the lower rep, higher weight lifting.
I also think that it's during this time, particularly if you ended your previous cycle and even in the off season with some injury recovery, that having the higher weight, lower rep as a means of strengthening all of the things around your muscles, including, tendons, and having and providing an appropriate load for those tendons, that this is the time to be able to do that before you then really ramp up impact forces that come with higher intensity.
Yeah.
Because as you and I have talked at length about in general for our athletes and for ourselves, that impact forces are almost exponential when it comes to speed work and intensity, and the faster you're going, whereas they're more linear when you're adding more mileage.
Yeah.
And so doing that strength work now not only serves the purpose of all the things that we're talking about, but it also truly is preparatory in the sense of preparing your body for the higher intensity when you're talking about keeping these 2 to 3 sessions a week of higher weight, lower rep.
Yeah. And I did have a note in here that I wanted to hit, which talked about the loading and why, I think people do get a little scared if they're going to, if they've never done 60 miles a week or 75 or whatever the goal is. And they see that at the front end of a training cycle, that also can be scary.
Yeah.
But to your point, running easy miles is just kind of a linear accumulation of stress. Whereas I looked at one measurement, I think this was from Montana Run Lab, that found that increasing your speed by 20% increases the reaction forces by 34%. So to put that to real numbers, the difference between a 9-minute mile and a 7:12 mile is 34% higher forces. And so we've turned it up by a third. And now if you think about when you're in a training cycle, if you're running a 9-minute easy mile, a 7:12 is probably close to your threshold, I'm going to guess off the top of my head. Not that far off. So that's not like speed work level, but you're already, every threshold mile you're running is 1.3 regular miles.
And if you're a person who tends to run on the faster end because you're of the social element and you're running with people that might be, faster than you, then that's something to consider and understand of what it is that you're putting your body through. It's not just that if people have 2 speeds in their mind of fast and not fast being something where they definitely can't have a conversation, and they're, they think about it more in structured interval terms of 400s, 800s miles.
Yeah.
And fail to consider that running faster, easy, quote unquote, mileage on the fastest end of your easy pace, there might be a purpose to that in the middle of a training cycle. I mean, we've given, not only for myself, but for athletes, a controlled easy, which is on the faster end. But, you constantly hear about these, elite athletes that are running like 8-9 minute miles, despite the fact that they clearly can and do go sub 6, if not sub 5 for the elite men, in their, marathon pace, right?
Yeah, and I think that brings me to kind of the last pace discussion of prep phase, which is it doesn't need to all be one easy pace.
Yep.
And I think that's a mistake, actually, when people go out and we see this in ultra athletes sometimes, where you're just going around like spending a lot of miles just shuffling. And the drawback to that is you're not really getting a good range of motion.
Mm-hmm.
You're not totally preparing your body for future training.
Yeah.
So this is why, one workout a week or two, maybe you throw in strides or you throw in hill repeats, or, I would say you can probably get away with, one of each in a week, or maybe you do 20 or 30 minutes at threshold. I would probably only do that once a week in a prep phase. But you can kind of mix up the paces and also mix up surfaces. So maybe you're doing it on trail and on road just to kind of get the stabilizers going and give yourself some variety so that it's not the same, the exact same loop or the exact same flat miles. So that kind of wraps up what a prep phase would look like. In some training plans, like Fitzinger actually does kind of do like a proper base phase within the plan, but that kind of leads us now into what would be pre-competition, which is getting into more of the meat of a traditional training plan. So Matt, why don't you talk about, this is kind of where you're headed, so maybe talk a bit about that.
Yeah, so as we leave the preparatory phase and into a pre-competition phase, we're starting to think about shifting away from a mindset, I am building the engine, into I'm now going to grow and tune the engine. And so if your prep phase is, let's make sure that we're building things in a way that's methodical and that we're strong and that it can handle more impact forces through the strength that we just talked about. Now we want to grow that a bit, increase your speed through threshold work, speed work, VO2 max work, and tuning it before we get into the competition phase, which you'll cover on some of the race-specific training paces and some other sort of fine-tuning work that you get into the competition side. So this section of your plan, as you said, is going to be the meaty part of it. It's probably where people like to live because it feels good. It feels good to do a workout and to finish that workout feeling perhaps not exhausted, but like you've done something. You've sweat a lot, and you're not going to be sweating as much in the prep phase because you're just not exerting yourself to the same degree as you do in a pre-competition phase, where you're going to be doing a lot of threshold work.
Yeah, and this is also the phase, I think, where people feel like they're making the most progress, because this is the section of the training cycle where one week maybe you have 4 minutes on, 2 minutes off, and the next week it's 5 minutes and 2 minutes, and then it's 6 minutes and 2 minutes. You can see the progression. You can very easily see it.
Especially if a coach is methodical in how they are thinking about continuing to turn the dials. You'll be able to see that as an athlete when you zoom out and don't look at the micro level, but look at it at the meso level. Because now we're talking about a sort of like a mesocycle, right? So you're going to see lots of threshold work. And it's important to note that threshold work does not equal, in all circumstances, threshold pace. And that's something that we've talked about being a ill-defined term, not because it can't be defined, but because people use it in different ways. It's often tempo is often a stand-in for threshold. But threshold as a physiological pace is the pace at which you can sustain for about a 45 to 55 minute period as effectively a race pace. And that's going to be different for obviously everybody, but it's based and standardized to an hour as opposed to a distance, right? Or just under an hour as opposed to a distance.
And it's essentially like under the hood, it's the rate, the actual threshold is where you are producing and clearing lactate at the same rate. So you can think of threshold pace as being the highest stress that you can put
Sustain.
on that particular system.
And in a sustainable way.
Right.
So when we're talking about then threshold work, threshold pace can be a part of that. You'll often hear about famous coaches, but just more generally, workouts where you're kind of going just above and just below. So those are common workouts, as well as when I say above or just below, I mean below or just below your over under your threshold, what your threshold pace is theoretically. But also sort of VO2 max work, which is designed to facilitate your ability to better clear lactate, particularly if you are doing high intensity, fast intervals, but with very short recoveries. So that can take the form of 30-30s, of 30 seconds on, 30 seconds jog, where you're going at a pretty fast clip for 30 seconds and off for 30 seconds. And you're doing 10, a lot of these. You're doing like 12 of these. And if anybody is thinking that doesn't sound that hard, I guarantee you, go try it. If you are running the 30s hard at a really solid, not an all-out sprint, but you're definitely going. You're definitely moving. 30 seconds is gonna feel pretty terrible. The 30 seconds off, that is, and you're gonna be like huffing to catch your breath, especially when you get to the last like 4. I think most people can get like through the first 4 being like, this is fine. And then like the last 8, if you're doing like 12 of them, are quite hard. Or another workout that I like to call the Molly Special, which is the 3-2-1 workout, which is 3 minutes hard, 2 minutes easy, 2 minutes hard, 1 minute easy, 1 minute hard, 1 minute easy. And then you repeat that maybe 3 times. And so you're progressively ratcheting down the amount of rest that you have, consistent with what we were saying of fast intervals, short recoveries. These adaptations can take several weeks to show up, but that's why if you're getting 2 mesocycles within this period, that's why this is normally an 8-week block, because that's going to be a 2 to 4 week sort of process. So you do 2 to 4 weeks worth of work, you get another 2 to 4 weeks worth of work. You can get 2 to 3 mesocycles inside the pre-competition phase. It's important to note then that when we're talking about strength training, because you're now increasing the amount of time likely that you are spending on your feet, that we
probably ratcheted down volume from the peak of your base phase.
So given we're talking about a lot of this increased threshold-based work aimed at improving your ability to clear lactate and the increased intensity that comes with that, that means that, as we were saying earlier, you need to rebalance away from the highest mileage that you had during the prep phase into something that is more balanced with the intensity that you have now introduced. And so the beginning part of a pre-competition phase may have lower volume than the peak volume that you had in the prep phase. You are probably going to build back up because, of course, people are thinking, well, aren't I going to have peak weeks, scattered throughout? And that is true. But it's important to come back down from that high that you might have had in the prep phase, where the purpose was to, as I started out by saying, building that engine. Here we're growing that engine. And so you're touching on a different adaptation, which is not the volume, but the intensity. Right. Anything I missed there before I talk about this cycle as it impacts strength?
Well, the one thing I was going to add is where in the prep phase, I think you can kind of do as much cross training or sub as much running for cross training as you need to. This is where ideally it's going to shift more to running, since that's more specific. If you need to include cross training as a way to rehab an injury, or
something you just like,
or it's something that you just like.
You love swimming, you like cycling.
Yeah.
I don't know who loves swimming, but
some people do.
I know. I put me in a pool that one time that I was injured, and I was like, well, I guess I'm swimming. I was a trooper, but I was gassed every single time. And
that's the one place I can smoke you, though.
Yo, you can totally smoke me in a pool. You can absolutely destroy me. Anybody can smoke me in a pool. I need. Let me rephrase that. No, you can smoke me in a pool. I need like flippers. All right, that's the level at which I am. So anyway, we digress.
But I was actually going to not steer people towards swimming, although it's a great like recovery day thing. Yeah. But if you are going to be subbing run miles for cross training,
but I think it's important though that some people are listening to this are probably triathletes, and so they're
totally.
So it's
you guys do your swimming, it's fine. Elliptical is the most applicable cross training form in similarity to running.
But you look so silly when you do it.
I know, but Parker Valby, which is what I was going to bring up, famously came in second at NCAAs doing like 25 to 30 miles a week and doing the rest of her training on an elliptical. So
fair.
It can be done.
Yeah.
And the reason that she was using the elliptical, or like it was elliptical and arc trainer, which are pretty similar, but those are both, they use more running muscles in the running way than any other form.
Got it.
Or maybe one of those like ellipticos.
Oh, yeah, the ellipticos.
If you like to go outside.
I've seen those in Prospect Park. And, I just want to scream, get a real bike. They're silly, but it's okay.
I always feel like it's just exercise equipment that escaped the gym.
Yeah. It's like if
see the world.
Yeah, it became self-aware, and it was like, I want to go outside. Should we get an elliptico for a backline?
Oh.
Follow
for like when you lose a bet.
Yeah,
to do one lap of Prospect Park.
Maybe that's well. Now that the shop has been totally cleaned. Not that it was, just to be clear, it wasn't like crazy dirty before, but I feel like I actually I cycled Katie's bike around the front of the shop, so maybe we can do I did two little loops. Oh. Yeah, so I feel like maybe the elliptico can be the way that we move around the shop now. It seems.
I think those have a big turning radius.
Yeah, that's fair. So because we've now increased our intensity and therefore impact forces and all of the rest of it, that is some degree of loading. And so I want to be careful by saying we should be reducing strength work, because it's true, but we don't want to reduce it to nothing, right? We still need to have load that is stimulating the necessary strength needed and adaptations needed for things like Achilles tendons and all of the rest of it that are super important for forward momentum. And so we might have gone from 2 to 3 sessions a week or 2 sessions a week in the prep phase and an off season to maybe 1 or 2 days a week. Again, shout out to that episode where we talked about this in our discussion with Kyler, although controversially, there was a part in there where he and I disagreed on the usefulness of and performance benefits of strength. I think there are more benefits. Anyways, just go listen to that episode. It was a very good discussion. And so here we're maintaining that strength, but I think you can still facilitate, particularly from a tendon perspective. I think this is where it's really important to continue doing that work.
Yeah, I would just say it's maintenance phase.
And vanity arms.
Totally.
I totally want, do the pump, do all the stuff.
Yeah. I think, yes, we do want to focus on maintaining the strength we already built. I would say if you were doing more of a full body thing in the prep phase, I would spend, if you're time limited, spend more time on the more specific running adaptations, and certainly on any areas that are injury prone. And also for trail runners, stabilizers are also important to keep working on throughout the year.
Totes. Yeah, I think that's a very good shout, and probably something to add into this for next time. But certainly if you're talking about trail running and ultras, and we did talk about this a bit in the strength episode as well, that continued strength in this part, it probably actually shouldn't be reduced that much. You might still reduce it, but
Yeah.
but it's really important when we're talking about, we just had 2 athletes run JFK 50, and there's a section of that. There's 15-ish miles on the AT. And so being able to be quick and nimble and, strong, stabilizer muscles is pretty critical. And so I think you can get away with it more when you're doing just kind of forward on a road, work. So that transitions us nicely to competition phase. So we've done the pre-competition, we've done the threshold work. Molly, what are we now going to do in the competition phase?
I think this one is probably the one that confuses people the most, because why is it a phase if you only have one goal race? I think the thing to remember, and the reason it's a phase and it's 4 to 6 weeks, is that this is the very specific training for your race that are things like, for a marathon, you're doing a lot of marathon pace. It's not necessarily work that's making you fitter per se, but it's getting those neuromuscular benefits, to get you used to running that pace and get the speed endurance at that pace specifically.
I think that's where I would have thought, I would have described it as getting fitter, but perhaps it's just a matter of perspective of like, yeah, a lot of it is that race specific.
Yeah, I think it's more like you're sort of like getting to the pointy end of the spear at this point. So you're shaping that fitness to a specific goal, which is going to look different from a half marathon to a full marathon or from an ultra.
I think certainly when, and I've come to you during this phase, or even during the pre-competition phase, to say like, I didn't pace that well. I generally get better at pacing during the competition phase because we're hitting that, we're hitting that race pace a bit more so that I understand what that feels like. I focus less on my physical state during this part because everyone listening can probably relate to having a marathon paced workout that's 10 miles or 8 miles, whatever your kind of like, keystone marathon paced workout is, and feeling like, how the hell am I going to do this for another 16 or what, whatever, right? Because you're just feeling, rough at the end of it. So on the basis that clearly you can and will, particularly if you know that you've done this before and you're going to hit it, what I am paying more attention to during that is not, oh my gosh, I feel like crap, how can I do this? Because I've gotten used to that feeling. I am thinking more about what biomechanically is happening. How fast is this? What's my, I don't mean cadence is in a specific number, but like, how does this feel like biomechanically? Because then that's what really matters. Like that I can identify and would encourage athletes to try and identify during this time period is how fast are things moving next to you, and noticing those things about your race pace so that when and if your watch doesn't tell you good data and you're trying, and it very much matters that you don't all of a sudden go 15 seconds a mile faster. You can then remember like, no, I know I am going, whatever the pace is, 6 minutes, 7 minutes. It might feel hopefully easier on race day, but you should know what 6 minute pace is, or 7 minute paces, or 8 minute paces from a like biomechanical perspective. And that's what I like to focus on during this phase.
Yeah. And I think it's something as runners we've probably collectively gotten worse with as watches got better or existed at all for this purpose. But
there's something telling you what that
pace is, but you really ideally need to, in my best marathons, I would be able to know if I was on pace or if I was, my margin was probably 3 to 5 seconds per mile too fast or too slow. Like you really do get to that level of knowing. And I think the mistake people sometimes make is basing it on RPE in workouts. And that changes radically from what mile 1 to mile 26 feels like.
And is the trap that you run into when you start a race and you're like, I feel amazing. And so but 100% agree. And that's why I don't like to focus on RPE, and I like to focus on how fast does this feel? I need to know what my body is doing at this pace, not from an RPE, like my mental state or like how hard it feels, but how fast do I feel like my legs are moving?
And there's the practical matters of getting used to taking a gel at that pace, or,
Exactly.
can I get the top off this bottle?
In advance of base state, even where I would just have pace in, say, a long run, it's very easy to not take
to avoid
taking your nutrition during that time. But that's a really important time to train your gut, right? And so if I had, let's say, 4 miles or 5 miles, I had relatively small amount of pace miles during this phase. I'd be taking it maybe during that first mile and the last mile, just because I'm trying to get my body used to consuming something at speed.
Yeah. So, and I think the last point about competition phase as a phase is this can also include things like your kind of B or B plus races. If you have a half marathon, you're going to have New York City half about a month out from Boston.
I will, yeah.
So if that's a race that you're going to run marathon pace, or you have a progression run, or whatever you kind of decide to do with, I don't mean we don't have a plan, but when one has those kind of races on a calendar, they can function within the training cycle and often are super helpful, because you do actually get to go through kind of the stress of the morning and the warm up and seeing how all of those things come together outside of a long run where you can really prepare things how you want it.
Yeah.
Those races can also be part of a competition phase. And I will throw in, I always enjoyed doing back-to-back marathons, which I kind of leveraged as a competition phase. And I would usually try to put them about 5 weeks apart. I think you can get away with 3, and it's kind of a different approach, but you're doing 2 races off of one training cycle, and then in between you're doing some recovery, just a little bit of strides just to kind of sharpen everything up again, and then a quick taper, and then race a second time.
Yeah.
And I think if it's something that you're interested in doing and kind of ready for in a recovery standpoint and are confident that you can manage that, you absolutely can flip a couple of races off of one training cycle, because as we said, your fitness does not sort of drop off a cliff just because you took a week off after your race.
Yeah. And that, just to reconcile that with what we've said earlier, clearly what we're saying here is that should be methodically planned.
Yeah, it's
well timed.
Lumping it into the competition phase,
right.
Not sort of tacking it on after a training cycle, which I think is sometimes what happens.
Yeah. So that brings us back to, then you've done your race, right? And this episode is not about the race, but you then get, the second you're done, you're now in the, let's assume you don't have something that's 2 weeks later, like a Boston to Big Sur, but let's assume now that you have some degree of off season, whether that's 1 week or, 3 months or more. That brings us back full circle to where we started this episode. So during the transition phase, which many people are in right now or coming out of this off season, we hope we've communicated and have convinced you that it is important to consider this proactively in your training, that you don't have to sacrifice speed, you don't have to sacrifice fitness, and that the volume gains or the aerobic fitness is something that you will sort of re-get back any part that has been lost during the pre-competition and competition phase and in the prep phase. So, and anything that might have been lost during a longer off season, you are definitely going to get back, but you're definitely not going to be losing fitness. So that's sort of point number 1. And point number 2 is that you can still get this mental break
And physical
and physical.
reset.
Yeah, and physical reset, allowing you to then focus on these other really important elements, like recovering from that like thing that was nagging you for like the last 3 months. Okay, let's figure out then, talk to a PT, do your massages, getting the things that are necessary in order to improve that. You're then going to roll that into the preparatory phase, where we've said that that's somewhere around 8 to 10 weeks. That's often not something that people are doing, right? Both the transition off season as well as this prep phase, a lot of people kind of skimp over, in part because those aren't the things that are the sort of sexy parts of a training cycle, but that this is where you can really build an engine and build it bigger and better. Probably a little bit higher of a strength element to this phase as well, where you're going to get in the gym more. You're probably not ramping up your intensity. We then get to the pre-competition phase, where you do start ramping up that intensity and you're really growing and fine-tuning your engine. You're improving your top end, and that's where the VO2 max work comes in. That's where the threshold work comes in. And then finally you get the competition phase, where coming from pre-competition, where we've reduced some of that strength work, we've entered the competition phase, where we're doing a lot of the race-specific pace. With all of that said, Molly, I think we've also tried to make the point that this is what we think hopefully is a helpful framework to think of these things. We don't want somebody to take away from this. This sounds like a lot of, structure.
Yeah.
We're actually trying to provide, I think the alternative is that people love structure. So I think
half the reason I think people jump from one race training cycle to the next is because they want the structure.
Right.
The problem is, if you're really only sort of repeating the pre-competition and competition phase, you're never really giving your body the chance to really grow a bigger aerobic engine or really recover from what it's just been through.
Right.
We don't want people to walk away with the idea that you need to skip your turkey trot because it's not on the macro cycle calendar, or you're only going to be running lonely solo miles for 3 months if you do a base build.
Right.
And I think that is not at all what we're saying.
Right.
We're saying that these are opportunities to, I think a base build, for example, because you're running different paces than you will be, when you're in the thick of training, you've got a pretty narrow, probably, number of people that you're going to be training with for that amount of time if you're in it for the social element of training. In the base phase, you can run, you're running easy miles, and as long as you're not running all of them at the top end or all of them at the bottom end of your easy pace, this is a great time to run with friends. It's a conversational pace. These are, these can be actually very social runs if that's what you want to get out of it.
Well, and, in episode 2, we talked about how to modify a training plan to fit your needs. And some of the things that are in there are relevant here, which is if you're saying to yourself, okay, cool, I do want to be more disciplined, in my upcoming cycle. That means that I might not be running as much, or I am doing a different thing than some of my friends. Part of what we talked about in episode 2 was, how do you still maintain, or even from a coaching perspective, how do you help an athlete in still being able to maintain the social element, where you might not be doing the same workout, but you're doing the warm up and cool down together or something to that effect. And so you can still do these other things that make sure that you're maintaining the social element, which is legitimately incredibly important. It's just also important that if your main goal is to improve your speed, or to get a particular time, or to BQ, or to hit the next threshold, whether that's 4 hours or 3 hours or 2:45 or an OTQ, right? That concept applies to everybody. The concept of having this thing that you're looking to get. And if that is your goal, and particularly if you are, a seasoned athlete in the sense that you've been at this for a couple of years, and so your early gains have kind of gone have been achieved, and now it's not that it, maybe it is very hard at this stage, or maybe you still have like a little bit more to go on the sort of like you've only been running for a few years, and so you still have like more time to just kind of like cut. But particularly if you're somebody who, like me, is struggling to get the last couple of minutes that I'm really hoping to get, these elements here of a proper off season are really important.
Yeah. I think you can only nail a training cycle like so well. And then you're going to have to start looking at the things outside the training cycle if
Right.
you want to keep improving.
Right. And sometimes we go to sleep and eating.
Yeah, which are also important.
But, it's also the, it's also the the not running and normalizing not running. And unfortunately, a lot of our, whether it's Strava or whatever, it doesn't glorify how much sleep you got, and doesn't glorify
how many easy miles,
or the time off, the off season that you've taken. It glorifies higher weeks, right? Higher mileage weeks and higher intensity and badges because you did this loop in a faster time than you did last week. And so unfortunately, the incentive system on a lot of platforms doesn't, I think, yield, the kind of training that we're talking about. I think there's an opportunity for some of these platforms, whether that's VDOT or whatever, particularly VDOT, because it's going to have your training plan of like the accuracy with which you achieved the workout. That, I think,
I've always thought that Garmin should actually, like, if you have a recovery day scheduled, it should like scold you if you
I agree. That would
do
be
too much.
That would be, I think that would be a fun, because I think, putting aside the joking part of when like you do a race and then the next day it's like, you could move, or that when it scolds you when you're during the taper, it's like, you have access to my training. Why can't you see that that's what I'm doing here? Anyway, Molly, any final thoughts from you before we wrap up?
Well, the last thing that I did want to talk about was other ways. I think a lot of people will say like, I really love the race atmosphere, and that's the thing that motivates me.
Yep.
So just some thoughts on if you're, whether you're doing 9+1 or you just have FOMO about not doing whatever half marathon that your friends are. Also think about things like you can pace a friend that's, going to be running at something in your easy range, or you sign up for that 10K, but then use it as a workout that week. There are ways to do these things that don't blow up the training plan. And I think what we advise against is there's the half marathon that you have FOMO about and you go out and rip it. And now we do need to give you a week of recovery that we didn't plan on. And now that week of training that was crafted for a reason is gone.
Yeah. This has been a lovely conversation, as always. We hope that this has been insightful but useful for listeners. If you found this conversation useful and think that somebody else would benefit from it, we would love if you could share. We have a very fun schedule coming up. What are some of the other things that we plan on talking about in the next month or two?
I think elite coaching.
Yep, with James McCurdy.
We're
definitely going to have a conversation with Mike Wardian about his adventures. He's got a lifetime of adventures, both before him and behind him. So there's a lot to talk about with Mike. If you have suggestions, we would love to hear them, because Molly and I love talking about this stuff. So subscribe, share.
Is that all the things?
Is that all the things you can smash the like button? But thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time.